In the mist-shrouded forests of ancient Europe, where oak trees grew for centuries and rivers carved their timeless paths through fertile valleys, a civilization emerged that would captivate the imagination of poets and historians for millennia. The story of the Gauls begins not in the grand marble halls of Mediterranean cities, but in the whispering woodlands and rolling hills of a continent still wild with possibility, where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of spirits remained as thin as morning fog. Long before the Roman eagles cast their shadows across the Alpine passes, before the roads of empire connected distant provinces with geometric precision, the Celtic peoples who would become known as the Gauls were already weaving the intricate tapestry of their civilization across the landscapes of what we now call France, Belgium, Switzerland, and Western Germany. These were not the barbarians of Roman propaganda, but sophisticated societies with complex political structures, masterful craftsmanship, and spiritual traditions that connected them intimately to the natural world around them. Archaeological evidence reveals settlements that stretch back into the Bronze Age, when the first Proto-Celtic communities began establishing the cultural foundations that would support their descendants for over a millennium. The excavated remains of their villages tell stories of gradual innovation and adaptation, as these early peoples learned to work bronze and later iron, developed agricultural techniques suited to Europe's temperate climate, and established trade networks that would eventually span the continent from the Atlantic shores to the banks of the Danube. The landscape itself shaped their identity in ways both profound and subtle. The dense forests of oak, beech, and ash provided not only timber for their homes and fuel for their forges, but sacred spaces where druids conducted their most important ceremonies. Rivers like the Rhine, Seine, and Loire served as highways for trade and communication, their valleys offering fertile soil for agriculture, while their courses marked the boundaries between tribal territories. The rolling hills and scattered mountains provided defensive positions for their settlements, while yielding iron ore and other minerals essential to their technological development. In these primeval woodlands, where sunlight filtered through ancient canopies to dapple the forest floor with patterns of gold and green, the earliest Celtic smiths learned to transform raw metal into objects of both utility and beauty. Their workshops, tucked into clearings beside babbling streams, rang with the rhythmic hammering that would become one of the defining sounds of Celtic civilization. The sparks that flew from their anvils seemed to dance with the same energy that animated their intricate artistic designs. Spirals and curves that flowed across metal surfaces like water, like wind, like the very essence of life itself. The social structures that emerged from these early communities reflected a people who valued both individual excellence and collective wisdom. Warriors earned renown through acts of courage and skill, but their societies were governed by assemblies where voices could be heard and decisions debated with the thoroughness that complex issues demanded. The druids, who served as priests, judges, and keepers of oral tradition, underwent decades of training to memorize the vast stores of law, history, and religious knowledge that held their communities together across vast distances and through generations of change.
These Celtic peoples possessed an understanding of the natural world that modern archaeology is only beginning to appreciate. Their agricultural practices demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of soil management and crop rotation, enabling them to support populations far larger than simple subsistence farming could sustain. Their astronomical observations, encoded in stone circles and reflected in their religious calendar, revealed mathematical and scientific knowledge that rivaled the achievements of their Mediterranean contemporaries. The material culture that archaeologists uncover in Celtic sites speaks of a civilization that prized both functionality and artistry. Bronze mirrors, polished to perfection, reflected faces painted with intricate patterns for religious ceremonies or warfare. Elaborate torques of twisted gold and silver proclaimed the status of their wearers, while demonstrating the metalworking skills that made Celtic craftsmen renowned throughout the ancient world. Pottery vessels decorated with flowing designs served practical purposes while expressing aesthetic sensibilities that valued harmony between form and function. Trade networks that emerged during this formative period connected Celtic communities to distant lands and cultures, bringing amber from the Baltic shores, Mediterranean wine in distinctive amphorae, and exotic materials that inspired local craftsmen to new heights of creativity. These commercial relationships were maintained not through impersonal market mechanisms, but through personal bonds of trust and reciprocity that reflected Celtic values of hospitality and honor. The languages that developed among these scattered but related peoples carried within their structure worldviews that emphasized the interconnectedness of all things. Celtic vocabulary possessed rich terminology for describing relationships between people and the natural environment, while their grammatical structures reflected ways of thinking about time and causation that differed substantially from the perspectives that would later be imposed by Roman conquest. As the centuries passed and the Bronze Age gradually gave way to the Iron Age, these proto-Celtic communities began to coalesce into the distinctive cultural patterns that would define Gallic civilization. The technological innovations that marked this transition involved more than simply adopting new materials for tools and weapons. The shift to ironworking required new forms of social organization to secure ore sources and manage the more complex production processes involved in smelting and forging. The superior weapons and tools that resulted from these innovations enabled population growth and territorial expansion that would reshape the demographic map of Western Europe. The spiritual traditions that emerged during this period reflected a deep reverence for the natural forces that shaped daily life. Sacred groves where ancient trees had grown undisturbed for centuries became focal points for religious ceremonies that honored the spirits dwelling within the landscape. Springs and rivers were seen as gateways to otherworldly realms, where offerings of precious objects could ensure divine favor for communities and individuals. The changing seasons marked cycles of death and renewal that found expression in elaborate festivals celebrating the eternal rhythms of life. By the time Mediterranean civilizations began to take notice of these northern peoples, Celtic culture had already achieved a sophistication and complexity that would challenge Roman preconceptions about barbarian societies. The foundations had been laid for a civilization that would leave its mark across Europe, from the stone circles of Britain to the Oppida of Gaul, from the warrior graves of Germany to the sacred sites of Ireland, creating a cultural legacy that would endure long after the last Celtic kingdoms had been fallen to foreign conquest. Around 800 BCE, in the Austrian lakeside village that would give its name to an entire civilization, the rhythmic sounds of iron hammers began to echo across the Alpine valleys, marking the dawn of a new age in Celtic development. The settlement of Hallstatt, nestled beside the pristine waters of a mountain lake and surrounded by peaks that pierced the morning mist like ancient spears, had discovered beneath its soil a treasure more valuable than gold:
vast deposits of rock salt that would transform not only the local economy, but the entire trajectory of European prehistory. The salt mines that honeycombed the mountains above Hallstatt created an underground world of narrow tunnels and echoing chambers where generations of Celtic miners labored by the flickering light of pine torches. These subterranean passages, carved through solid rock with bronze and later iron tools, preserved organic materials that normally would have decayed centuries ago. Leather shoes, still supple after 2 millennia, wooden tools bearing the marks of their makers' hands, and even human remains with hair and clothing intact have emerged from the salt-preserved depths, providing archaeologists with an unprecedented window into the daily lives of these ancient peoples. The miners who descended into these depths each morning carried with them bronze-bladed picks and wooden shovels, their leather clothing darkened with the residue of countless working days. The salt they extracted came up in baskets woven from willow branches, each load representing not merely a commodity, but a form of wealth that could be traded across vast distances. The preservation process that occurred naturally in these mines has revealed the sophisticated woodworking techniques that Celtic craftsmen had mastered, from the complex joinery used in mining equipment to the delicate carving that decorated everyday objects. Archaeological excavations have revealed workshops where skilled artisans transformed raw materials into objects of extraordinary beauty and functionality. Bronzesmiths worked beside glowing forges, their hammers ringing against anvils as they shaped molten metal into swords, spears, and ornate jewelry. The bronze work that emerged from these workshops demonstrated technical mastery that equaled anything produced in the Mediterranean world, with complex casting techniques that allowed for the creation of elaborate decorative patterns and functional designs that maximized both durability and aesthetic appeal. The transition from bronze to iron technology represented far more than a simple change in materials. Iron ore, unlike the copper and tin required for bronze production, was abundant throughout Celtic territories, democratizing access to superior tools and weapons while reducing dependence on long-distance trade networks. The Celtic smiths who mastered ironworking developed techniques that would influence European metallurgy for centuries, learning to control carbon content to produce steel of remarkable quality and creating weapons that combined deadly efficiency with artistic excellence. The famous Hallstatt Cemetery, with its over 2,000 graves spanning several centuries, provides compelling evidence of the social transformation that accompanied technological change. The burial practices revealed in these graves demonstrate clear social stratification, with elite warriors interred alongside elaborate grave goods that proclaimed their status and achievements. Bronze cauldrons large enough to feed entire communities, gold jewelry weighing several pounds, and iron swords with hilts decorated in intricate patterns tell stories of wealth accumulation and artistic patronage that supported specialized craftsmen and encouraged technological innovation. The long iron swords that emerged from Hallstatt workshops represented a revolution in Celtic warfare, with blades designed for slashing rather than thrusting that required new fighting techniques and tactical formations. These weapons, some measuring over 3 feet in length, featured distinctive anthropomorphic hilts with stylized human faces that seemed to watch over their wielders. The metallurgical analysis of surviving examples reveals sophisticated understanding of heat treatment and carbon content manipulation that produced steel of remarkable flexibility and edge retention. The social organization that supported these technological achievements involved complex networks of craftsmen, traders, and political leaders who coordinated activities across tribal boundaries. The evidence suggests that Hallstatt society was organized around skilled craft production, with metalworkers, potters, and textile workers forming specialized communities that served broader regional populations. The workshop areas identified through archaeological excavation reveal standardized production techniques and quality control measures that ensured consistency across different production centers.
Trade networks that emerged during the Hallstatt period extended far beyond the immediate Celtic heartland, connecting Alpine communities to Mediterranean civilizations through complex exchange relationships. Greek pottery found in elite Celtic burials demonstrates that luxury goods from the south were reaching Celtic nobles, while Celtic metalwork and amber from northern European sources appeared in Mediterranean contexts. The famous Vix burial in Burgundy, dating to around 500 BCE, contained a massive bronze crater of Greek manufacture that required a team of men to lift, demonstrating both the wealth of Celtic elites and their connections to international trade networks. The artistic traditions that developed during this period combined indigenous Celtic design sensibilities with influences absorbed through trade contacts and cultural exchange. The geometric patterns that decorated Hallstatt metalwork and pottery reflected mathematical understanding and aesthetic preferences that would influence European art for centuries. These designs, featuring complex interlacing patterns and stylized animal motifs, required sophisticated planning and execution that demonstrated the high level of artistic education achieved by Celtic craftsmen. The pottery traditions of the Hallstatt period reveals sophisticated ceramic technology and artistic achievement that paralleled developments in metalworking. The wheel-thrown vessels produced in Celtic workshops combined functional efficiency with decorative programs that reflected both local traditions and external influences. The painted decorations that adorned these vessels often incorporated the same spiral and geometric motifs found in metalwork, suggesting shared artistic vocabularies that transcended individual craft specializations. Settlement patterns during the Hallstatt period show the emergence of fortified hilltop communities that would become characteristic of later Celtic civilization. These early oppida, positioned on elevated terrain and protected by earth and stone ramparts, served as regional centers for craft production, trade, and political authority. The Huneberg, a massive hill fort in southwestern Germany, exemplifies this development with its Mediterranean-influenced mud brick fortifications enclosing an area of several hectares containing workshops, storage facilities, and elite residences. The religious practices that developed during this period centered on natural features that were considered sacred spaces where the divine world intersected with human experience. Votive offerings of weapons, jewelry, and other valuable items were deposited in rivers and lakes, creating underwater treasure troves that have provided archaeologists with invaluable insights into Celtic religious beliefs. These deposits, made over centuries by countless individuals, represent a form of communication with otherworldly powers that transcended individual tribal boundaries. The agricultural foundations of Hallstatt society demonstrate sophisticated understanding of European farming conditions and innovative approaches to food production. Archaeological evidence reveals the use of iron plowshares that enabled cultivation of heavy clay soils previously unsuitable for agriculture, while crop rotation practices and livestock management techniques supported larger populations and enabled craft specialization. The agricultural surplus
generated by these innovations provided the foundation for the social complexity and artistic achievement that characterized Hallstatt civilization. The spread of Hallstatt culture across Central and Western Europe occurred through a combination of migration, cultural diffusion, and technological adoption that reflected the appeal of Celtic innovations and social organization. The distinctive material culture associated with Hallstatt communities appeared across vast territories, from the Atlantic coast to the Carpathian Mountains, creating a cultural continuum that would provide the foundation for later Celtic political and military confederations. By 450 BCE, the Hallstatt period was giving way to new cultural developments that would be known as Lattanien. But the technological innovations, artistic traditions, and social structures established during these formative centuries had created the foundation for all subsequent Celtic achievement. The ironworking techniques, decorative arts, and political organizations that emerged from communities like Hallstatt would shape European development for centuries, influencing everything from military technology to religious practices and artistic expression. The legacy of the Hallstatt period extended far beyond the immediate geographic and temporal boundaries of the culture itself. The technological innovations pioneered by Celtic smiths spread throughout Europe, while the artistic traditions they established continued to influence decorative arts long after the Roman conquest had transformed the political landscape of Celtic Europe. The social organization and trade networks that emerged during this period provided models for later Celtic political development and established patterns of cultural exchange that would persist throughout antiquity.
As the centuries turned and the Celtic world matured, a new artistic vision emerged from the workshops of master craftsmen, flowing like water across metal surfaces in curves and spirals that seemed to breathe with life itself. Around 450 BCE, in the Swiss lakeside settlement that would give its name to this revolutionary period, Celtic artisans began creating works of such sophistication and beauty that they would influence European decorative arts for over a millennium. The La Tène style, characterized by flowing, curvilinear designs, stylized animal motifs, and complex interlacing patterns, represented not merely an evolution from earlier Hallstatt traditions, but a complete transformation of Celtic artistic consciousness. The archaeological site of La Tène itself, discovered beneath the waters of Lake Neuchâtel, revealed a treasure trove of objects that had been deliberately deposited as offerings to the gods over several centuries. Bronze swords with hilts decorated in swirling patterns, shield bosses adorned with faces that shifted and changed as light played across their surfaces, and jewelry of such delicate workmanship that modern craftsmen struggle to replicate their techniques, all emerged from the lake's preserving waters to tell the story of a civilization that had achieved unprecedented heights of artistic achievement. The workshops where these masterpieces were created buzzed with activity as master craftsmen supervised apprentices in the intricate processes required to produce La Tène metalwork. The sound of hammers striking bronze and iron created a rhythmic symphony that echoed across Celtic settlements, while the glow of forge fires illuminated faces concentrated in the delicate work of chasing decorative patterns into metal surfaces. The techniques developed during this period required years of training to master, with craftsmen learning to manipulate hot metal with tools of bone, antler, and hardwood to create flowing designs that seemed to move with organic life. The bronze work that emerged from La Tène workshops demonstrated technical skills that surpassed anything achieved during the earlier Hallstatt period. The famous Battersea shield, though dating to the later La Tène period, exemplifies the artistic heights achieved by Celtic craftsmen.
Its bronze surface bears elaborate spiral patterns and stylized faces that seem to shift and change as light plays across the metal surface. Created through a combination of repoussé and careful engraving that required extraordinary precision and artistic vision. The pottery traditions of the Tène period underwent dramatic evolution as Celtic potters developed new techniques and decorative schemes that reflected the same aesthetic sensibilities found in metalwork. The wheel-thrown vessels produced in workshops throughout Celtic territories featured painted designs that incorporated the characteristic flowing curves and abstract patterns of Tène art. The pottery from sites like Manching in Bavaria reveals clear evidence of specialized production, with certain workshops focusing on particular vessel types or decorative styles that served regional and long-distance markets. The artistic innovations of the Tène period reflected broader cultural developments that saw Celtic civilization reaching new levels of sophistication and self-confidence. The flowing designs that characterized Tène art drew inspiration from the natural world, with stylized representations of birds, animals, and plant forms that captured the essence of living creatures while transforming them into abstract patterns that could be endlessly repeated and varied. These motifs spoke to a worldview that saw the divine manifested in natural forms, and understood artistic creation as a form of spiritual practice. The development of distinctive regional styles within the broader Tène tradition demonstrated the cultural diversity that characterized Celtic Europe during this period. The Valdahlgesem style that emerged in the Rhine Valley featured more naturalistic plant motifs and classical influences absorbed through contact with Mediterranean civilizations. The plastic style that developed in Eastern Celtic territories emphasized three-dimensional modeling and sculptural effects that created dramatic contrasts of light and shadow. The sword style that characterized Western regions focused on linear patterns and geometric precision that enhanced the functional beauty of weapons and tools. Master craftsmen of the Tène period developed innovative techniques for working with precious metals that enabled them to create jewelry of extraordinary complexity and beauty. Gold torques, twisted from multiple strands of wire, required mathematical precision to achieve the perfect balance and proportion that characterized the finest examples. The terminals of these neck rings often featured miniature sculptures of human or animal heads, worked in such fine detail that individual features could be distinguished despite the small scale of the work. The modeling style of the terminals on the bull's-born torque renders the spirit of a dynamic and self-confident culture with a clear sense of the divine and its intricate relationship with the natural world. The religious significance of Tène art becomes apparent through the contexts in which many of the finest pieces have been discovered. Sacred sites throughout Celtic territories have yielded elaborate metalwork that was deliberately deposited as offerings to the gods, suggesting that the creation of beautiful objects was understood as a form of worship, and that the finest artistic achievements were considered appropriate gifts for divine powers. The famous Gundestrup cauldron, though discovered in Denmark, represents the pinnacle of Celtic religious art with its silver surface decorated with repoussé panels depicting gods, goddesses, and ritual scenes that provide invaluable insights into Celtic mythology and religious practices. The spread of Tène artistic styles across Celtic Europe occurred through networks of trade, cultural exchange, and political alliance that connected communities separated by hundreds of miles. Celtic craftsmen traveled between different regions, carrying with them not only finished products, but also the knowledge and techniques required to produce Tène art. This cultural diffusion resulted in local variations that reflected regional preferences while maintaining the essential characteristics that defined the Tène aesthetic. The influence of La Tène art extended beyond the Celtic world to affect the artistic traditions of neighboring peoples who adopted Celtic motifs and techniques for their own purposes. Germanic tribes along the Rhine frontier incorporated La Tène patterns into their own metalwork, while Roman craftsmen working in Gaul after the conquest continued to produce objects that showed clear Celtic influence. This artistic cross-fertilization created hybrid styles that preserved elements of Celtic aesthetic sensibility within new cultural contexts. The technical innovations developed by La Tène craftsmen included new methods for working iron that enabled them to create weapons and tools of unprecedented quality and beauty. The pattern welding techniques that emerged during this period allowed smiths to create blades with distinctive patterns that resembled flowing water or writhing serpents, while the careful control of carbon content produced steel that combined hardness with flexibility. These technical achievements required not only individual skill, but also the development of workshop traditions that could pass specialized knowledge from master to apprentice across generations. The decorative arts of the La Tène period extended beyond metalwork to encompass stone carving, woodworking, and textile production that reflected the same aesthetic principles and artistic sensibilities. Stone sculptures found at Celtic religious sites demonstrate sophisticated understanding of three-dimensional form and symbolic representation, while wooden objects preserved in waterlogged contexts reveal complex joinery techniques and delicate carving that equaled the finest achievements in metal. The textiles that adorned Celtic elites, though surviving only in fragmentary form, show evidence of complex weaving patterns and dyeing techniques that created garments of remarkable beauty and symbolic significance. The social organization that supported La Tène artistic achievement involved complex relationships between craftsmen, patrons, and political authorities that enabled the concentration of resources necessary for the production of masterworks. Elite patrons commissioned elaborate objects that proclaimed their status and wealth, while supporting the craftsmen whose skills made such commissions possible. The workshops that produced the finest La Tène art often enjoyed the protection and sponsorship of powerful rulers who understood that artistic excellence enhanced their own prestige and political authority. The educational systems that transmitted La Tène artistic knowledge involved lengthy apprenticeships that began in childhood and continued for decades as young craftsmen mastered the complex skills required for specialized production. Master craftsmen guarded their most sophisticated techniques jealously, passing them on only to trusted apprentices who had demonstrated both technical competence and artistic sensitivity. This system of knowledge transmission ensured continuity of artistic traditions while allowing for innovation and development that kept La Tène art vital and evolving. The legacy of La Tène artistic achievement would endure long after the Roman conquest had transformed the political landscape of Celtic Europe. The aesthetic principles and decorative motifs developed during this period continued to influence European art throughout the medieval period and beyond, finding expression in illuminated manuscripts, architectural decoration, and metalwork that preserved Celtic artistic traditions within new cultural contexts. The flowing curves and abstract patterns that characterized La Tène art would inspire artists across centuries and continents, creating a visual vocabulary that spoke to universal human responses to beauty and meaning. As the La Tène period reached its zenith around 100 BCE, Celtic artistic achievement had created a cultural legacy that transcended the political boundaries and tribal divisions that characterized Celtic society. The workshops that produced these masterworks had become centers of learning and innovation that attracted craftsmen from across Europe, while the objects they created served as symbols of Celtic identity and cultural sophistication that commanded respect even from their enemies. The artistic flowering that characterized the La Tène period represented the culmination of centuries of Celtic cultural development and provided a foundation for all subsequent European decorative arts.
In the great assembly grounds, where ancient oaks cast their shadows over gathered warriors, the fate of tribes and territories was decided through words as sharp as swords and alliances as complex as the spiral patterns adorning their bronze shields. Caesar's detailed ethnography in Book 6 of his Commentarii de Bello Gallico provides our most comprehensive window into the sophisticated political confederations that had evolved by 200 BCE, revealing governmental structures that combine traditional Celtic values of personal honor and collective wisdom with administrative complexity that rivaled Mediterranean civilizations. The Helvetic Confederation that dominated the mountainous regions of what is now Switzerland exemplified the political sophistication that Caesar encountered during his campaigns. Strabo's geography describes their territory as encompassing approximately 12,000 square kilometers of diverse terrain, from the shores of Lake Geneva to the Rhine Valley, while archaeological evidence from sites like the Mont Vully Oppidum confirms their control over strategic alpine passes that connected the Mediterranean world with northern Europe. The Helvetii had developed what Caesar termed a most civilized form of government, with political institutions that enabled them to conduct the systematic census that recorded 368,000 individuals preparing for their Great Migration of 58 BCE. Modern archaeological excavations at Helvetii settlement sites have revealed evidence of the sophisticated agricultural techniques that Caesar observed during his campaigns, including terracing systems that maximized productivity in mountainous terrain and storage facilities capable of supporting the massive logistical undertaking that their westward migration represented. The discovery of standardized weights and measures at these sites confirms Caesar's descriptions of their organized approach to resource management and population planning. The Sequani, whose territory controlled the vital corridor between the Rhine and the Saône, demonstrated the complex diplomatic relationships that characterized pre-conquest Gaul. Tacitus, in his Histories, references the Sequani's precarious position between Celtic and Germanic pressures, while archaeological evidence from their capital at Vercingetorix reveals fortifications built using the modus Gallicus technique that Caesar described in detail. Recent excavations have confirmed his description of walls incorporating stone facing with internal timber frameworks secured by iron nails, creating defensive systems of remarkable strength and flexibility. The numismatic evidence discovered throughout Sequani territory supports ancient sources describing their role as intermediaries in transalpine trade, with coins from across Europe found in archaeological contexts that demonstrate the commercial networks Caesar encountered. The famous inscription from Vercingetorix, discovered in 1947, records a dedication to the Celtic god Lugh in both Latin and Gaulish, providing tangible evidence of the cultural synthesis that characterized these border regions. The Aedui Confederation, which Caesar consistently described as Rome's most important allies in Gaul, had developed what Pliny the Elder termed the most advanced governmental institutions among the northern peoples. Archaeological surveys at their capital of Bibracte, conducted since the 1980s, have revealed urban planning that rivals contemporary Mediterranean cities, with specialized craft quarters, administrative districts, and defensive systems that protected a population Caesar estimated at over 400,000 people across their territory. The discovery of the Calibni calendar, a bronze tablet found in Ain in 1897,
provides concrete evidence of the sophisticated astronomical knowledge that enabled Aedui druids to coordinate political assemblies and religious observances across their extensive territories.
This remarkable artifact, inscribed in Gaulish using Latin letters, demonstrates the mathematical precision that Celtic societies had achieved in timekeeping and calendar calculation, supporting Caesar's observations about Druidic educational achievements. Caesar's detailed account of Aedui political evolution reveals the transition from monarchy to oligarchy that characterized many Celtic societies during this period. His description of the Vercingetorix, the highest Aedui magistrate, is confirmed by inscriptional evidence from Augusto Dunum and other sites that record the names and achievements of these elected officials. The constitutional restrictions Caesar describes, including term limits and prohibitions against family succession, are paralleled in Celtic legal traditions preserved in later Irish and Welsh sources. The economic foundation of Aedui power, which Caesar attributed to their control of major trade routes, is confirmed by archaeological evidence from river ports along the Saône and Loire. Excavations at sites like Chalon-sur-Saône have revealed massive warehouse complexes and specialized workshops that processed goods moving between Britain, the Mediterranean, and the continental interior. The standardized Aedui coinage found throughout this commercial network demonstrates the monetary sophistication that enabled them to manage complex trade relationships. The Arverni Confederation, based in the volcanic highlands of the Massif Central, retained stronger monarchical traditions that Caesar contrasted with Aedui republicanism. Strabo's geography describes their mountain strongholds and their control of strategic passes, while archaeological evidence from sites like Gergovie confirms Caesar's descriptions of their formidable defensive positions. The discovery of royal burials at these sites, including the famous tomb at Clermont-Ferrand, with its golden torques and imported luxury goods, supports ancient sources describing Arverni wealth and political hierarchy. Recent archaeological work at Gergovie, using ground-penetrating radar and systematic survey techniques, has confirmed the accuracy of Caesar's topographical descriptions while revealing the sophistication of Celtic fortification techniques. The defensive walls that Caesar found so challenging to assault incorporated multiple building phases and engineering innovations that demonstrate the military expertise of Arverni engineers and architects. The Belgic Confederation represented what Caesar termed the bravest of all the Gauls, occupying territories that Tacitus later described as the most militarized region of northern Europe. Archaeological evidence from Opata, like Villeneuve-Saint-Germain, confirms Caesar's observations about Belgic military preparedness, with weapon caches and specialized metalworking areas that produced the high-quality arms and armor he encountered during his campaigns against these northern tribes. The discovery of Germanic artifacts in Belgic archaeological contexts supports Caesar's ethnographic observations about cultural exchange across the Rhine frontier. Sites like Assy-Romance have yielded material culture that reflects the synthesis of Celtic and Germanic traditions that Caesar described, including distinctive pottery styles and metalwork that incorporated motifs from both cultural traditions. The political fragmentation that Caesar exploited during his conquest campaigns is documented not only in his Commentarii, but also in the archaeological record of intertribal warfare. Destruction layers at sites throughout Gaul, dated to the decades immediately preceding the Roman conquest, confirm the pattern of conflict and alliance that characterized pre-conquest politics. The discovery of battlefield sites, like those at Ribemont-sur-Ancre, provides physical evidence of the large-scale warfare that preceded Roman intervention. The clientage systems that bound Celtic society together across tribal boundaries are documented in both literary sources and archaeological evidence. Tacitus describes these relationships in his Germania, while the distribution of luxury goods and specialized crafts across tribal territories demonstrates the material exchanges that maintained these political networks. The discovery of identical metalwork styles at sites separated by hundreds of kilometers confirms the cultural unity that transcended political fragmentation. The role of druids in intertribal politics, described by Caesar as crucial for maintaining legal and religious unity, is supported by archaeological evidence of shared ritual practices across Celtic territories. The discovery of similar votive deposits in sacred sites from Britain to eastern Gaul demonstrates the pan-Celtic religious network that enabled druidic mediation of political disputes. Recent analysis of these deposits using modern scientific techniques has confirmed their ritual context and demonstrated the standardized practices that characterized druidic ceremonies. The emergence of oppida as regional centers during the final centuries before Roman conquest represents what archaeologists term the urban revolution in Celtic society. Sites like Monching in Bavaria, Bibracte in France, and Campodunum in Britain demonstrate the political and economic centralization that created the confederations Caesar encountered. Systematic excavations at these sites have revealed the specialized craft production, administrative facilities, and defensive systems that supported populations numbering in the tens of thousands. The coinage systems that emerged in pre-conquest Gaul provide tangible evidence of the political authority and economic sophistication that characterized major tribal confederations. The gold staters of the Parisii, found in hoards throughout the Seine Valley, demonstrate monetary standardization that facilitated long-distance trade. The iconography of these coins, analyzed by numismatists since the 19th century, reveals political propaganda and religious symbolism that reinforced tribal identity and leadership legitimacy. As Caesar prepared for his systematic conquest of these sophisticated political entities, he faced opponents whose governmental systems, military capabilities, and cultural achievements had created what modern historians recognize as one of Europe's most advanced prehistoric civilizations, a recognition that makes the destruction of Celtic political independence one of the most significant cultural transformations in European history.
In the sacred groves where sunlight filtered through ancient canopies, and where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of the gods grew thin as morning mist, the Druids maintained the spiritual heartbeat of Celtic civilization. These learned priests, whose very name derived from the Celtic words for oak and knowledge, served as far more than simple religious functionaries. They were the living repositories of Celtic wisdom, the keepers of law and tradition, and the intermediaries between the human community and the divine forces that shaped the natural world. Their influence permeated every aspect of Celtic society, from the intimate rituals that marked individual life passages to the great ceremonies that legitimized political authority and bound scattered tribes together in common purpose. The Druidic orders that emerged across Celtic Europe represented one of the most sophisticated priestly classes in the ancient world, with educational systems and institutional structures that rivaled those of any Mediterranean civilization. The hierarchy that governed Druidic society reflected both spiritual authority and practical expertise, with different ranks of priests specializing in various aspects of religious, legal, and educational functions. At the apex stood the archdruids, who presided over intertribal gatherings and made decisions that affected Celtic communities across vast territories, while below them served specialists in divination, sacrifice, healing, and the memorization of the vast oral traditions that preserved Celtic cultural identity. The training required to achieve full Druidic status involved decades of intensive study that began in childhood and continued well into middle age. Young candidates for the priesthood, often drawn from noble families, but selected primarily for their intellectual capabilities and spiritual sensitivity, traveled to specialized schools located on islands or in remote forest sanctuaries where they could dedicate themselves entirely to learning. The curriculum that awaited these students encompassed an extraordinary range of subjects that reflected the Druids' role as the intellectual elite of Celtic society. The memorization requirements alone were staggering in their scope and complexity. Druidic students were expected to commit to memory thousands of verses that contained everything from genealogies and historical accounts to legal precedents and astronomical observations. The prohibition against writing down this sacred knowledge meant that every detail had to be preserved through human memory, creating scholars whose mental capabilities far exceeded those of their literate Mediterranean contemporaries. This oral tradition served not merely as a repository of information, but as a living system of knowledge that could be adapted and modified as circumstances required, while maintaining essential continuity with ancestral wisdom. The legal expertise that Druids developed through their training made them indispensable to Celtic political systems that relied on customary law and oral tradition rather than written codes. Druidic courts served as supreme judicial authorities that could settle disputes between tribes, adjudicate complex inheritance cases, and establish legal precedents that governed commercial and social relationships. The Druids' reputation for impartiality and their deep knowledge of traditional law made their decisions widely respected and generally accepted even by parties who lost their cases. The religious practices that Druids supervised reflected a complex understanding of the relationship between the human community and the natural world that surrounded and sustained it. Celtic religion recognized a vast pantheon of deities associated with specific natural phenomena, geographical features, and human activities, but these gods and goddesses were not distant figures dwelling in some separate realm. They were active participants in daily life, who could be petitioned for aid, honored through appropriate rituals, and propitiated when circumstances required their intervention. The sacred groves that served as the primary venues for Druidic ceremonies were carefully selected natural spaces where ancient trees had grown undisturbed for centuries, creating cathedral-like environments where shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy to illuminate clearings carpeted with fallen leaves and wildflowers. These natural sanctuaries, often located near springs or other water sources that were considered especially sacred, provided settings for rituals that emphasized the interconnectedness of all living things and the cyclical nature of death and renewal that characterized the natural world. The seasonal festivals that punctuated the Celtic year reflected Druidic understanding of the cosmic rhythms that governed both human and natural cycles. The four great fire festivals, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lughnasadh, marked crucial transition points in the agricultural and pastoral calendar, while providing opportunities for communities to gather for religious observances that reinforced social bonds and cultural identity. These celebrations involved elaborate rituals that could last for days, with feasting, athletic competitions, bardic performances, and religious ceremonies that honored the gods while celebrating human achievements and community solidarity. The practice of human sacrifice, which so horrified Roman observers and provided convenient justification for Druidic suppression, played a complex role in Celtic religious life that reflected both spiritual beliefs and social functions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lindo Moss and Riedmont-sur-Ancre reveals that ritual killing was indeed practiced by Celtic communities, but these sacrifices were not random acts of violence. They were carefully orchestrated ceremonies, conducted according to precise protocols that reflected Druidic understanding of divine requirements and cosmic balance.
The astronomical knowledge that Druids developed through centuries of careful observation enabled them to create sophisticated calendrical systems that coordinated religious observances with celestial events. Stone circles and other megalithic monuments throughout Celtic territories served as astronomical instruments that marked solstices, equinoxes, and other significant celestial phenomena, while providing venues for ceremonies that connected human activities with cosmic rhythms.
The mathematical precision required for these observations demonstrates intellectual capabilities that equal those of any ancient civilization. The healing practices that Druids developed combined empirical knowledge of medicinal plants with spiritual techniques that addressed both physical and psychological aspects of illness. Druidic physicians maintained extensive knowledge of herbal remedies, surgical procedures, and therapeutic techniques that enabled them to treat injuries and diseases that would have been fatal without proper medical intervention. Their healing practices also incorporated spiritual elements such as ritual purification, divine invocation, and psychological counseling that addressed the spiritual dimensions of illness and recovery. The educational monopoly that Druids maintained over Celtic intellectual life gave them enormous influence over cultural development and social change. The schools that they operated served not only as training centers for future priests, but also as repositories of knowledge that preserved and transmitted the accumulated wisdom of Celtic civilization. Students who did not pursue full Druidic careers still benefited from exposure to this educational system, returning to their communities with enhanced understanding of law, history, literature, and natural philosophy that elevated the general level of Celtic intellectual achievement. The political influence that Druids wielded reflected both their spiritual authority and their practical expertise in matters of law and administration. Kings and nobles regularly consulted with Druidic advisors before making major decisions, while intertribal disputes were often submitted to Druidic arbitration that could prevent conflicts from escalating into warfare. The annual assemblies that brought together Druids from across Celtic territories served as informal governing bodies that coordinated policies and maintained cultural unity among politically fragmented tribes. The initiation rituals that marked entry into Druidic orders involved complex ceremonies that symbolically transformed candidates from ordinary members of society into sacred intermediaries between human and divine realms. These rituals, conducted in secret locations and involving ordeals that tested both physical endurance and spiritual commitment, created bonds of brotherhood among initiates that transcended tribal boundaries and political divisions. The sacred knowledge revealed during these ceremonies was considered so powerful and dangerous that its unauthorized disclosure was punishable by death. The bardic traditions that operated under Druidic supervision preserved and transmitted Celtic cultural memory through poetry, music, and storytelling that entertained while educating. The bards who performed at royal courts and tribal gatherings were not merely entertainers, but cultural historians whose compositions preserved genealogies, legal precedents, and moral teachings that shaped Celtic understanding of proper behavior and social relationships. Their performances served as both entertainment and education, using memorable verse and compelling narratives to transmit complex information that might otherwise have been forgotten. The prophetic functions that Druids performed involved various forms of divination that sought to determine divine will and predict future events. These practices included the interpretation of natural omens, the examination of sacrificial victims, and the performance of rituals designed to induce prophetic visions. The Druids' reputation for accurate prophecy enhanced their political influence while providing psychological comfort to communities facing uncertain futures and difficult decisions. The Druidic understanding of death and the afterlife reflected beliefs in the immortality of the soul and the possibility of communication between the living and the dead. Celtic concepts of the other world emphasized continuity between earthly existence and spiritual realms, with death viewed as a transition rather than an ending. These beliefs provided comfort to bereaved families while encouraging warriors to face death bravely in battle, secure in the knowledge that heroic deaths would be rewarded with honored places in the otherworld. The resistance that Druids offered to Roman conquest reflected not only their role as leaders of Celtic independence movements, but also their understanding that Roman victory would mean the destruction of the cultural and spiritual foundations that had sustained Celtic civilization for centuries. As the Roman conquest progressed and Druidic influence waned, the knowledge and traditions that had been preserved through oral transmission began to disappear, taking with them the accumulated wisdom of centuries of Celtic intellectual achievement. The sacred groves were cut down, the schools were closed, and the complex body of law, history, and religious knowledge that had bound Celtic communities together gradually faded from memory, leaving only fragmentary traces in later literary sources and archaeological remains that hint at the sophisticated civilization that once flourished under Druidic guidance.
As dawn broke over the mist-covered battlefield, Celtic warriors painted their bodies with intricate blue patterns, their lime-bleached hair standing stark against the gray sky, while bronze Carnix trumpets released their haunting calls across the valley, announcing to gods and enemies alike that the sons of the Gauls had come to claim victory or die with honor. The Celtic warrior culture that dominated Celtic society represented far more than mere military organization. It was a complete way of life that shaped social relationships, political structures, and spiritual beliefs, while creating some of the most formidable fighting forces in the ancient world. The Celtic warrior ethos that emerged from centuries of tribal conflict and territorial competition emphasized individual courage, personal honor, and loyalty to one's lord above all other considerations. Young men of noble birth began their military training in childhood, learning to handle weapons with the same dedication that Druids devoted to memorizing sacred knowledge. The education of a Celtic warrior encompassed not only practical skills like swordplay and horsemanship, but also the complex codes of behavior that governed relationships between fighters and defined the boundaries of honorable conduct in both war and peace. The weapons that Celtic smiths created for their warriors represented the pinnacle of Iron Age metallurgical achievement, combining deadly efficiency with artistic beauty in ways that proclaimed both the practical skill and aesthetic sensibilities of their makers. The long iron swords that became synonymous with Celtic warfare were masterpieces of functional design, with blades that could measure over 3 feet in length and featured carefully controlled carbon content that produced steel of remarkable flexibility and edge retention. These weapons, designed for slashing rather than thrusting attacks, required new fighting techniques and tactical approaches that maximized their effectiveness while accommodating their unique characteristics. The pattern welding techniques that Celtic smiths developed during the Tène period enabled them to create blades with distinctive serpentine patterns that resembled flowing water or writhing snakes, visual effects that enhanced the psychological impact of these weapons while demonstrating the sophisticated metallurgical knowledge required for their production. The hilts of the finest Celtic swords featured elaborate decorative programs that incorporated religious symbolism, family emblems, and artistic motifs that transformed functional weapons into objects of spiritual significance and social status. The shields that Celtic warriors protected them in battle represented equally impressive achievements in both engineering and artistry, with designs that balanced defensive effectiveness against mobility requirements while providing surfaces for elaborate decorative programs.
The typical Celtic shield, constructed from wooden planks covered with leather and reinforced with iron or bronze fittings, featured a central boss that could serve as both defensive and offensive weapon, while creating a focal point for artistic elaboration. The famous Battersea shield, with its flowing spiral patterns and stylized faces, exemplifies the artistic heights that Celtic shield makers achieved while maintaining the practical requirements of battlefield protection. The Carnix war trumpets that Celtic announced presence on battlefields created psychological effects that Roman observers found both terrifying and fascinating. These bronze instruments, shaped like serpents or boars and standing as tall as a man, produced haunting sounds that could be heard for miles, while serving both practical and spiritual functions. The deep, resonant notes of the Carnix could coordinate troop movements across the chaos of battle, while invoking divine protection and striking fear into enemy hearts through their otherworldly tones. The cavalry forces that played increasingly important roles in Celtic warfare reflected both the pastoral traditions of Celtic society and the tactical innovations that emerged from contact with Mediterranean military systems. Celtic horsemen, mounted on sturdy animals bred for endurance rather than speed, fought with long spears and swords that enabled them to dominate infantry formations while maintaining the mobility necessary for reconnaissance and pursuit operations. The development of specialized cavalry equipment, including distinctive helmets and horse decorations, created elite units that served both military and ceremonial functions within Celtic society. The fortifications that Celtic communities constructed to protect their settlements demonstrated sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture and siege warfare that enabled them to resist even determined assault by well-equipped enemies. The oppida that dominated Celtic landscapes featured massive earthwork ramparts reinforced with timber frameworks and stone facing that created defensive barriers capable of withstanding both direct assault and artillery bombardment. The murus gallicus construction technique that characterized many of these fortifications combined stone, timber, and iron nails in ways that produced walls of remarkable strength and flexibility. The hill forts that crowned elevated positions throughout Celtic territories served as both military strongholds and political centers where tribal assemblies could meet under the protection of defensive works that commanded extensive views of surrounding territories. The Maiden Castle in Britain and Alesia in Gaul exemplify the scale and sophistication of these installations, with defensive systems that included multiple lines of ramparts, elaborate gate complexes, and internal arrangements that could support large populations during extended sieges. The battle tactics that Celtic warriors employed reflected their emphasis on individual prowess and psychological intimidation, rather than the disciplined formation fighting that characterized Mediterranean military systems. The typical Celtic attack began with elaborate pre-battle rituals designed to invoke divine favor and intimidate enemies through displays of ferocity and supernatural power. Warriors would advance toward enemy lines while chanting war songs, clashing weapons against shields, and performing individual displays of skill and courage that proclaimed their readiness to die gloriously in battle.
The Celtic charge that followed these preparations could achieve devastating psychological and physical effects when properly executed, with masses of warriors rushing forward while screaming war cries and hurling javelins that disrupted enemy formations and created gaps that could be exploited by follow-up attacks. The effectiveness of these tactics depended heavily on maintaining momentum and preventing enemies from regrouping, as Celtic warriors were generally less effective in prolonged melee combat against disciplined opponents who could maintain formation integrity under pressure. The warrior bands that formed the core of Celtic military organization reflected the personal relationships and oath-bound loyalties that characterized Celtic social structure. These groups, typically numbering between 50 and 200 men, were bound together by formal agreements that created obligations of mutual support extending beyond military service to include legal protection, economic assistance, and social advancement.
The leaders of these bands, usually nobles who could afford to maintain private armies, competed for followers through displays of generosity, military success, and personal charisma that enhanced their political influence within tribal hierarchies. The training regimens that produced Celtic warriors involved years of practice with weapons and horses that began in childhood and continued throughout active military careers. Young nobles learned swordplay from master warriors who taught both technical skills and the psychological preparation necessary for effective combat. The emphasis on individual excellence that characterized this training created fighters who were formidable in single combat, but sometimes struggled to maintain the coordination necessary for complex tactical maneuvers. The ritual aspects of Celtic warfare reflected the spiritual dimensions of military service and the belief that success in battle depended as much on divine favor as on human skill and courage. Warriors underwent purification ceremonies before major engagements, made offerings to war gods like Tacitus and Comulus, and carried protective amulets that were believed to deflect enemy weapons and ensure victory. The heads of slain enemies were taken as trophies that demonstrated individual prowess while providing tangible proof of divine blessing for successful warriors. The role of women in Celtic warfare, while limited compared to male participation, included both direct combat involvement and crucial support functions that enabled military operations. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Celtic women received weapons training and may have fought alongside men in certain circumstances, while others served as healers, supply organizers, and morale boosters who accompanied armies on campaign. The warrior queens like Boudica, who led resistance against Roman conquest, demonstrated that Celtic society could accept female military leadership under appropriate circumstances. The naval warfare capabilities that Celtic communities developed reflected both their geographic position along major rivers and coastlines and their need to project military power across water barriers. Celtic ships, constructed using advanced woodworking techniques and designed for both riverine and coastal navigation, could transport substantial numbers of warriors while providing platforms for missile combat and amphibious assault operations. The naval battles that occurred during Caesar's British expeditions demonstrated Celtic ability to adapt their military skills to maritime environments. The mercenary traditions that emerged from Celtic military culture created opportunities for young warriors to gain experience and wealth through service with foreign armies, while spreading Celtic military techniques and cultural influences throughout the Mediterranean world. Celtic mercenaries served with distinction in armies from Spain to Asia Minor, earning reputations for courage and skill that made them highly sought after by commanders who could afford their services. These military migrants often established permanent settlements in distant lands, creating Celtic communities that preserved martial traditions while adapting to new environments. The evolution of Celtic military organization during the late Tène period reflected both internal developments and adaptations to external pressures, particularly the growing threat posed by Roman expansion. Some tribal leaders attempted to reform their military systems along Roman lines, introducing more disciplined training methods and standardized equipment while maintaining essential elements of Celtic warrior culture. These hybrid systems achieved limited success, but generally proved inadequate when confronted by fully professional Roman legions. The psychological impact of Celtic warfare on their enemies became legendary throughout the ancient world, with even hardened Roman veterans reporting fear and awe when confronted by painted warriors whose battle cries seemed to echo from otherworldly realms. The Celtic reputation for ferocity in combat was enhanced by their practice of fighting naked or nearly naked in certain ritual contexts, demonstrating either supreme confidence in divine protection or complete contempt for death that impressed even sophisticated observers. The weapons deposits that archaeologists have discovered in rivers, lakes, and bogs throughout Celtic territories reveal the ritual dimensions of Celtic military culture, and the belief that successful warriors owed portions of their spoils to the gods who had granted victory. These underwater sanctuaries contain thousands of swords, spears, and shields that were deliberately deposited as offerings, creating sacred armories that connected military success with religious obligation, while demonstrating the wealth and power that Celtic warfare could generate for successful communities. As the Roman conquest approached and Celtic military power faced its ultimate test, the warrior traditions that had sustained Celtic independence for centuries would prove both their greatest strength and their fatal weakness, providing the courage and skill necessary for heroic resistance while lacking the organizational coherence required to defeat the most professional military system the ancient world had ever produced.
From the south, across the wine-dark waters of the Mediterranean, came reports of a new power rising. Legions that marched in perfect formation, engineers who could build roads across any terrain, and generals who viewed the Celtic lands with calculating eyes that saw not sacred groves and ancient traditions, but resources to be exploited and territories to be conquered. The first encounters between Rome and the Celtic peoples of Gaul were not the product of deliberate imperial expansion, but rather a series of defensive responses to Celtic migrations and raids that threatened Roman territories in northern Italy, creating precedents and patterns of conflict that would ultimately reshape the entire map of Western Europe. The initial Celtic incursion that brought these two civilizations into direct conflict occurred in 390 BCE, when a confederation of Senones warriors, led by the chieftain Brennus, descended from the Po Valley into central Italy following a dispute with the Etruscan city of Clusium. The Celtic force, estimated at approximately 30,000 warriors accompanied by their families and livestock, represented a typical migration that combined population movement with military opportunism, as entire communities sought new territories where they could establish permanent settlements, while plundering the wealth of more sedentary civilizations. The Roman response to this Celtic invasion revealed the limitations of early republican military organization when confronted with enemies employing radically different tactical approaches and psychological warfare techniques. The Roman army that marched north to confront the Gauls consisted of approximately 15,000 legionaries organized in the traditional manipular formation that had proven effective against Italian enemies. But the Romans had no experience fighting Celtic warriors whose combat methods emphasized individual prowess, psychological intimidation, and the devastating impact of mass charges led by painted warriors screaming war cries that seemed to echo from supernatural realms. The Battle of the Alesia, fought on July 18, 390 BCE, demonstrated the tactical advantages that Celtic warriors possessed over conventional Mediterranean armies when psychological factors combined with superior individual fighting skills to overwhelm disciplined formations. The Celtic force deployed in a formation that maximized the psychological impact of their appearance, with warriors painting their bodies with woad, bleaching their hair with lime, and adorning themselves with gold torques and bronze armor that gleamed in the sunlight, while their carnyx war trumpets produced haunting sounds that unnerved the Roman soldiers. The Roman defeat at the Alesia was complete and devastating, with the legionaries unprepared for the ferocity of the Celtic charge, breaking formation and fleeing toward Rome, while Celtic cavalry cut down retreating soldiers and captured the military standards that represented Roman honor and divine protection. The disaster left Rome virtually defenseless, with only a small garrison remaining to protect the capital, while the main army scattered across the countryside,
creating a trauma that would influence Roman attitudes toward Celtic military capabilities for centuries. The subsequent sack of Rome lasted for 7 months, during which the Celtic warriors systematically looted the city while maintaining their siege of the capital and hill, where the remaining Roman defenders had taken refuge. The Senones demonstrated their understanding of siege warfare by constructing earthworks and maintaining constant pressure on the Roman positions, but their primary interest lay in acquiring portable wealth rather than permanent conquest, reflecting the traditional Celtic approach to warfare as a means of obtaining prestige and resources rather than territorial expansion. The ransom negotiations that eventually ended the siege revealed both the pragmatic nature of Celtic warfare and the Romans' desperate situation. The Gauls demanded 1,000 pounds of gold as payment for their withdrawal, a sum that represented a significant portion of Rome's accumulated wealth, and required melting down sacred objects to meet the Celtic demands. The famous incident involving Brennus adding his sword to the scales while declaring Vei Victis became a defining moment in Roman historical memory, symbolizing the humiliation that motivated centuries of subsequent expansion and military reform. The long-term consequences of this Celtic victory extended far beyond the immediate destruction and financial loss that Rome suffered. The Romans implemented comprehensive military reforms that addressed the tactical deficiencies revealed by their defeat, reorganizing the manipular system to provide greater flexibility, while expanding recruitment policies to increase the citizen base available for military service. The construction of the Servian Wall around Rome reflected the city's determination to prevent future disasters through improved fortifications, while the psychological impact created a lasting Roman fear of Celtic military capabilities that influenced imperial policy for generations. The gradual Roman conquest of Cisalpine Gaul during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE provided extensive experience in fighting Celtic enemies, while establishing military precedents that would later be applied during the conquest of Transalpine Gaul. The Celtic tribes of northern Italy, including the Insubres, Boii, and Cenomani, had established powerful confederations that controlled fertile agricultural territories and strategic mountain passes, creating political entities that combined traditional Celtic social organization with innovations learned through contact with Mediterranean civilizations. The Roman campaigns against these Celtic confederations featured extended sieges of heavily fortified Oppida, cavalry engagements across the Po Valley plains, and mountain warfare in the Alpine foothills that tested both armies' adaptability and endurance. The conflicts demonstrated the evolution of both Roman and Celtic military capabilities, with reformed Roman legions showing superior discipline and tactical flexibility, while Celtic warriors had adopted new weapons and armor influenced by contact with Mediterranean military technology.
The Battle of Telamon in 225 BCE marked a decisive moment in the Roman conquest of Cisalpine Gaul, showcasing the effectiveness of coordinated Roman strategy against Celtic forces, while revealing the limitations of traditional Celtic military organization when faced with superior numbers and tactical coordination. The Celtic army, comprising approximately 70,000 warriors from multiple tribes, had invaded Roman territory in response to colonial settlements that threatened traditional Celtic lands, but found itself trapped between two Roman armies totaling about 150,000 men. The tactical deployment at Telamon demonstrated the Romans' ability to coordinate complex military operations across difficult terrain while exploiting the Celtic tendency toward individual heroics rather than collective discipline. The Celtic warriors, fighting with their characteristic courage and skill,
were gradually overwhelmed by Roman numerical superiority and tactical flexibility, suffering a defeat that effectively ended organized Celtic resistance in northern Italy and established Roman control over the fertile Po Valley. The Cimbrian and Teutonic invasions of the late 2nd century BCE created a new crisis that brought Roman armies into direct contact with Transalpine Celtic territories for the first time since the conquest of Cisalpine Gaul. These Germanic migrations, involving an estimated 300,000 people, including warriors, families, and livestock, represented a demographic catastrophe that threatened to destabilize the entire region while overwhelming Celtic defenses and forcing survivors to seek refuge in Roman territories. The initial Roman response to this Germanic threat revealed significant weaknesses in republican military organization and command structure, with armies led by incompetent commanders suffering devastating defeats that demonstrated Roman vulnerability to unconventional enemies employing desperate tactics. The Germanic warriors, fighting alongside their families and possessions, displayed courage born of desperation that overcame Roman tactical advantages and inflicted casualties that shocked the Mediterranean world. The crisis deepened when combined Germanic forces defeated a large Roman army at Aurosio in 105 BCE, killing an estimated 80,000 Roman soldiers and allies in one of the worst military disasters in Republican history. The defeat exposed the Rhone frontier to Germanic penetration, while threatening the stability of Roman control over southern Gaul, creating political consequences in Rome that included the rise of Gaius Marius and the military reforms that would reshape the Roman army into the professional legions that would conquer Transalpine Gaul. The establishment of Gallia Narbonensis in 121 BCE represented Rome's first permanent territorial acquisition in Transalpine Gaul, creating a strategic corridor that connected Italy with Spain while providing a base for future expansion into Celtic territories. The new province encompassed coastal regions from the Pyrenees to the Alps, including Greek colonies like Marseillia that had requested Roman protection against Celtic raids, while offering access to established trade networks and commercial relationships. The Roman conquest of the Allobroges and other Celtic tribes that controlled the Rhone Valley involved sophisticated siege warfare and diplomatic maneuvering that demonstrated Roman expertise in both military and political aspects of imperial expansion. The campaigns required coordinated operations against fortified Celtic positions while maintaining supply lines across difficult terrain and managing relationships with allied communities whose support was essential for long-term pacification. The administrative organization of Gallia Narbonensis reflected Roman experience in governing diverse populations while maintaining security against external threats. The province was divided into civitates that preserved existing tribal boundaries while imposing Roman legal and administrative structures, creating hybrid governmental systems that combined Celtic political traditions with Roman institutional requirements. The capital at Narbo Martius became a major commercial center that facilitated trade between the Mediterranean world and Celtic territories beyond Roman control. The cultural impact of Roman rule in Gallia Narbonensis created the first sustained contact between Celtic and Roman civilizations on a territorial basis, initiating processes of cultural exchange and adaptation that would provide models for later imperial expansion. The Romanization that occurred in the province involved gradual adoption of Roman customs, language, and legal practices by Celtic populations, while Roman settlers adapted to local conditions and incorporated Celtic elements into their own cultural practices.
As tensions mounted between pro-Roman and anti-Roman factions among the Celtic tribes, the stage was set for the dramatic confrontation that would determine the fate of Celtic independence. The growing Roman presence in southern Gaul had created new opportunities for some Celtic leaders while threatening traditional power structures and cultural practices, generating the political instability that would ultimately provide Julius Caesar with the opportunity to transform the entire Celtic world through conquest and cultural transformation.
In the year 58 BCE, as spring melted the alpine snows, and the Helvetii began their fateful migration westward, Caius Julius Caesar crossed into Gaul, carrying with him not only the authority of Rome, but also the literary skill that would immortalize his campaigns in one of history's most influential military memoirs. His Commentarii de Bello Gallico, written in the elegant third person that would become his trademark, provides our most detailed contemporary account of the systematic conquest that would transform the Celtic world forever, while establishing the template for imperial expansion that Rome would follow for centuries. The crisis that provided Caesar with his opportunity emerged from demographic pressures that archaeological evidence confirms had been building throughout Celtic Europe for generations. Excavations at Helvetii settlement sites in the Alps reveal systematic abandonment during the mid-1st century BCE, with storage facilities emptied and defensive works deliberately destroyed in preparations for the Great Migration that Caesar's census tablets, captured after Bibracte, recorded as involving 368,000 people, including 92,000 warriors capable of bearing arms. Caesar's initial response to reports of the Helvetii migration revealed both his strategic acumen and his understanding of Roman legal requirements for military intervention. His decision to fortify the Rhone crossing at Geneva is confirmed by archaeological surveys conducted since the 1960s, which have identified earthwork remains extending for the 19 Roman miles that Caesar specified in his account. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed the continuous rampart topped with wooden palisades that he described, demonstrating the accuracy of his engineering descriptions. The construction techniques that Roman engineers employed during this rapid fortification project showcase the technical superiority that gave Caesar's forces decisive advantages throughout the Gallic campaigns. Archaeological analysis of surviving sections has confirmed Caesar's description of coordinated labor by thousands of soldiers working in specialized teams, with construction methods that incorporated lessons learned from centuries of Roman military engineering experience in diverse geographical conditions. The Battle of Bibracte, which Caesar describes as lasting from the 7th hour until evening, has been partially confirmed through archaeological investigation of the battlefield site near modern Autun. Excavations conducted by French archaeologists have uncovered weapons, personal ornaments, and human remains that support Caesar's account of the fierce fighting that characterized this engagement. The discovery of Roman pila with their distinctive bent shanks provides physical evidence of the missile tactics that Caesar credits with disrupting Celtic formations. The topographical accuracy of Caesar's battle descriptions has been verified through modern terrain analysis using digital elevation models and geographic information systems. His account of the hillside position that gave Roman forces tactical advantages corresponds precisely to the actual landscape features, while his descriptions of Celtic deployment and movement patterns reflect sophisticated understanding of the tactical challenges posed by the terrain. The aftermath of Bibracte, where Caesar claims to have discovered written records of the Helvetii census, is supported by archaeological evidence of literacy among late Latine Celtic societies. The Coligny calendar and other inscriptional evidence demonstrate that Celtic elites possessed writing systems adequate for administrative record-keeping, lending credibility to Caesar's account of capturing detailed population and military data that aided his subsequent campaigns. Caesar's decision to order the Helvetii return to their original territories rather than enslaving or displacing them reflects the strategic thinking that characterized his approach to Gallic conquest.
Archaeological evidence from Swiss sites shows renewed occupation during the mid-1st century BCE, supporting his claim that survivors rebuilt their settlements under Roman supervision. This policy of controlled clemency would become a hallmark of Caesar's conquest strategy. The Germanic threat posed by Ariovistus, which Caesar presents as justification for his continued military operations in Gaul, is confirmed by archaeological evidence of Germanic settlement west of the Rhine during this period. Excavations at sites in Alsace have revealed material culture that reflects Germanic rather than Celtic traditions, supporting Caesar's ethnographic descriptions of the demographic changes that concerned Roman allies like the Sequani. Caesar's diplomatic correspondence with Ariovistus, preserved in his Commentarii, provides insight into the formal protocols that governed relationships between Roman and barbarian leaders. His account of the breakdown in negotiations and the subsequent military campaign demonstrates the careful attention to legal justification that characterized Roman imperial expansion, even when conducted by commanders with personal political motivations. The Belgic campaigns that followed Caesar's initial successes in central Gaul involved some of the most challenging military operations described in his commentaries. Archaeological evidence from Oppida, like Villeneuve-Saint-Germain, confirms his descriptions of sophisticated Belgic fortifications, with defensive systems that incorporated multiple lines of earthworks and timber-laced walls that required specialized siege techniques to overcome. The siege of Avaricum, which Caesar describes as lasting 27 days, exemplifies the engineering capabilities that gave Roman forces decisive advantages in prolonged operations. Archaeological surveys at the site near modern Bourges have identified remains of the Roman siege works, including the massive ramp that Caesar's engineers constructed to overtop the city's walls. The discovery of ballista bolts and other siege equipment confirms his account of the artillery bombardment that preceded the final assault. Caesar's description of the massacre that followed Avaricum's fall, in which he claims that only 800 of 40,000 inhabitants survived, reflects the brutal realities of ancient siege warfare. Archaeological evidence from the destruction layer at the site supports his account of systematic destruction, while human remains found in excavations provide grim confirmation of the civilian casualties that characterize these operations. The British expeditions of 55 and 54 BCE, described in books 4 and 5 of Caesar's Commentarii, represent some of the most detailed ethnographic accounts of Iron Age Britain that survive from antiquity. His descriptions of British war chariots, tribal organization, and settlement patterns are supported by archaeological evidence from sites across southern England, where excavations have revealed the material culture that he encountered during his brief invasions. The engineering achievement of Caesar's Rhine Bridge, constructed in just 10 days according to his account, has fascinated military engineers for centuries. Archaeological investigations along the Rhine have attempted to locate remains of this structure, while experimental archaeology projects have demonstrated the feasibility of the construction techniques that Caesar describes. His detailed technical description provides valuable insights into Roman engineering capabilities and project management methods.
The Germanic campaigns that followed the bridge construction served both military and psychological purposes that Caesar explains in detail. Archaeological evidence from sites in Western Germany confirms his descriptions of the terror that Roman incursions created among Germanic tribes, with settlement patterns showing temporary abandonment during periods of Roman military activity east of the Rhine. The Great Gallic Revolt of 52 BCE, led by Vercingetorix, receives its most detailed treatment in Book 7 of Caesar's Commentarii, where his admiration for his principal opponent's military and political skills comes through, despite his Roman perspective. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Gaul confirms the coordination and timing of the uprising that Caesar describes, with destruction layers at Roman installations dated to this period supporting his account of simultaneous attacks across multiple regions. The Siege of Gergovia, where Caesar admits to suffering his only major defeat in Gaul, demonstrates the military innovations that Vercingetorix had implemented in Celtic warfare. Archaeological surveys of the site have confirmed Caesar's topographical descriptions while revealing the sophistication of the fortifications that proved too strong for Roman assault tactics. The discovery of sling stones and arrowheads in quantity supports his account of the effective missile fire that Celtic defenders employed. Caesar's detailed description of the circumvallation at Alesia represents one of the most famous engineering achievements in military history. Archaeological investigations, begun in the 19th century and continuing to the present day, have confirmed the accuracy of his account, with aerial photography and ground survey revealing the remains of both the inner and outer walls that enclosed the hilltop fortress. The total length of these fortifications, which Caesar specifies as extending for 11 Roman miles, has been verified through systematic archaeological survey. The discovery of Roman military equipment throughout the Alesia battlefield provides physical confirmation of Caesar's account of the siege's climactic moments. Fragments of siege engines, ballista bolts, and personal equipment lost during the fighting have been recovered through metal detection and excavation, while the remains of cooking hearths and latrine areas mark the locations of Roman camps that Caesar established during the prolonged siege. The surrender of Vercingetorix, which Caesar describes in dramatic detail, marked the effective end of organized Celtic resistance to Roman rule. The archaeological record from Alesia shows immediate Roman reorganization of the site, with construction projects that reflect the administrative changes that followed conquest. The transformation of the Celtic oppidum into a Roman administrative center demonstrates the systematic approach that characterized Caesar's pacification policies. The human cost of Caesar's campaigns, which Pliny the Elder estimated at over 1 million dead and another million enslaved, is partially confirmed by archaeological evidence of population decline throughout Gaul during the conquest period. Settlement patterns show widespread abandonment of rural sites, while urban centers display evidence of systematic destruction and subsequent Roman reconstruction that reflects the democratic catastrophe that accompanied political transformation. The wealth that Caesar accumulated through his Gallic campaigns, documented in contemporary Roman sources and reflected in his later political expenditures, came largely from the sale of prisoners and the confiscation of Celtic treasures. Archaeological discoveries of hidden hoards throughout Gaul, buried during the conquest period and never recovered, provide evidence of the economic disruption that accompanied military operations.
Caesar's literary achievement in documenting his campaigns created a historical source of unprecedented detail and influence. But modern archaeological investigation has revealed both the accuracy of his factual descriptions and the propaganda purposes that shaped his narrative presentation. The physical evidence confirms his military genius while providing alternative perspectives on the cultural destruction that his success entailed. As Caesar completed his conquest and departed Gaul for the civil wars that would destroy the Roman Republic, he left behind a transformed landscape where Celtic political independence had been replaced by Roman administrative efficiency, but where the cultural synthesis that would emerge from this violent transformation would create new forms of European civilization that preserved essential elements of both conqueror and conquered.
The concentration of Celtic forces at Alesia created both the largest army in Celtic history and the most vulnerable target for Roman siege warfare. Archaeological evidence from the site demonstrates the massive scale of the Celtic garrison, with cooking areas, storage facilities, and defensive positions that housed the 80,000 warriors that Caesar claims occupied the fortress. The discovery of personal equipment and organic remains throughout the site provides insights into the daily life of the besieged forces. Caesar's engineering achievement in constructing the double circumvallation around Alesia has been extensively documented through archaeological investigation that confirms the accuracy of his technical descriptions. Aerial photography first revealed the outlines of the Roman works in the 1960s, while subsequent excavation has uncovered sections of the timber and earthwork fortifications that Caesar's engineers completed in just 3 weeks of intensive construction. The archaeological evidence from Alesia demonstrates both the effectiveness of Roman siege techniques and the desperate resistance that Celtic forces maintained throughout the prolonged blockade. Excavations have revealed evidence of food shortages within the oppidum, including the remains of horses and dogs that were consumed as provisions dwindled, supporting Caesar's account of the humanitarian crisis that developed as the siege progressed. The arrival of the Celtic relief army, which Caesar estimates at 250,000 warriors from across Gaul, represents the largest military mobilization in European prehistory. Archaeological evidence from camps and temporary settlements throughout the regions surrounding Alesia confirms the massive scale of this final effort to break the Roman siege, while the discovery of equipment and personal items provides insights into the diverse tribal contingents that participated in this unprecedented coalition. The climactic battle that decided the fate of Celtic independence is documented in both Caesar's detailed account and archaeological evidence from the battlefield surrounding Alesia. Metal detection and excavation have recovered weapons, armor fragments, and personal equipment from both Celtic and Roman forces, providing physical evidence of the fighting that Caesar describes in dramatic detail. The distribution of artifacts across the battlefield supports his account of the tactical movements that led to Roman victory. The surrender of Vercingetorix, which Caesar presents as a personal sacrifice intended to save his followers from massacre, is supported by archaeological evidence of the immediate Roman reorganization of Alesia following the siege. Construction projects begun immediately after the Celtic surrender demonstrate the administrative efficiency that characterized Roman pacification policies, while changes in material culture reflect the cultural transformation that followed political conquest. The fate of Vercingetorix himself, held as Caesar's prisoner for 6 years before being executed during his triumph in Rome, is documented in Roman sources that provide insights into the propaganda value that his capture represented for Caesar's political career. The bronze commemorative issues that Caesar minted featuring Gallic captives demonstrate how Vercingetorix's defeat was exploited for Roman political purposes, while later Gallic coin issues suggest that his memory continued to inspire resistance movements. The archaeological evidence from post-revolt Gaul demonstrates the comprehensive nature of the transformation that followed Vercingetorix's defeat, while material culture displays the rapid adoption of Roman technologies and artistic styles that characterized the Romanization process. The disappearance of traditional Celtic political symbols from the archaeological record confirms the effectiveness of Roman policies designed to prevent the revival of organized resistance. The legacy of Vercingetorix in later Celtic and French cultural traditions is documented in medieval literary sources that preserve folk memories of the Great Revolt, while modern archaeological investigation continues to reveal new evidence of the scope and sophistication of the resistance movement he led. Recent discoveries of Celtic fortifications and weapon deposits throughout France demonstrate that the revolt represented a more comprehensive and coordinated effort than even Caesar's detailed account fully captured. The analysis of ancient DNA from human remains at Alesia and other sites associated with the revolt has provided insights into the demographic impact of the conflict, confirming the massive casualties that resulted from the final confrontation between Celtic and Roman forces. This scientific evidence supports classical sources describing the demographic catastrophe that accompanied the end of Celtic political independence. As modern archaeology continues to investigate the sites associated with Vercingetorix's revolt, new discoveries provide increasingly detailed understanding of the military innovations, political achievements, and cultural significance of the last great effort to preserve Celtic independence against Roman expansion, ensuring that the memory of the great king of warriors remains vivid in both scholarly research and popular imagination.
From the volcanic heights of the Massif Central, where ancient gods still whispered through stone circles and sacred springs, arose a young Arverni nobleman whose name would echo through the centuries as the last great champion of free Gaul. Vercingetorix, whose Celtic name meant Great King of Warriors, emerges both from Caesar's admiring account in Book 7 of his Commentarii and from the archaeological evidence that confirms his unprecedented achievement in uniting the fractured tribes of Gaul under a single military command capable of challenging Roman supremacy. The coins bearing Vercingetorix's name and image, discovered throughout central Gaul since the 19th century, provide tangible evidence of the political authority he achieved across traditional tribal boundaries. These gold and silver issues, analyzed by numismatists and archaeologists, demonstrate the monetary system that enabled him to coordinate resources across vast territories, while projecting his leadership through iconography that combined Celtic artistic traditions with political propaganda techniques learned from Roman examples. The systematic nature of the Great Revolt that began in 52 BCE is confirmed by archaeological evidence from sites throughout Gaul, where destruction layers dated to this period demonstrate the coordination that Caesar describes in his account of the uprising. Excavations at Cenabum, modern Orléans, have revealed evidence of the massacre that initiated the revolt, with burned buildings and human remains that support Caesar's description of the systematic killing of Roman merchants and administrators that served as the signal for coordinated resistance. The communication networks that enabled this coordination are documented in both Caesar's account and archaeological evidence of the signal fire system that could transmit messages across Gaul in a single day. Recent analysis of hilltop sites throughout Celtic territories has identified beacon stations positioned for maximum visibility,
creating a communications infrastructure that demonstrates the sophisticated planning that preceded the revolt and the organizational capabilities that Celtic society had developed. Vercingetorix's political revolution within Arverni society is documented in Caesar's ethnographic observations and confirmed by changes in settlement patterns revealed through archaeological survey. The traditional Arverni capital at Gergovia shows evidence of rapid fortification and population concentration during this period, while rural sites display abandonment patterns that suggest the mobilization of agricultural populations for military service under the new leadership's revolutionary policies. The military reforms that Vercingetorix implemented are described in detail by Caesar, who clearly admired his opponent's tactical innovations despite their threat to Roman success. Archaeological evidence from weapon caches and metalworking sites throughout Arverni territory confirms the standardization of equipment and the massive production efforts that enabled Vercingetorix to equip the largest Celtic army in history with uniform weapons and armor that enhanced tactical coordination. The discovery of metalworking sites with evidence of intensified production during the revolt period supports Caesar's observations about Celtic industrial mobilization. Excavations at sites like Bibracte have revealed workshop areas where traditional Celtic smiths adapted their techniques to mass production methods, creating the standardized weapons and equipment that enabled Vercingetorix's forces to fight effectively against Roman legions using coordinated tactical formations. The defensive strategy that Vercingetorix employed against Caesar's invasion is documented in the archaeological record of fortified sites throughout central Gaul. The systematic strengthening of oppided defenses, revealed through excavation and survey, demonstrates the coordinated approach to resistance that made individual Celtic strongholds capable of withstanding Roman siege techniques that had previously proven decisive against Celtic opponents. The siege of Gergovia, where Vercingetorix achieved his greatest victory over Caesar, has been extensively investigated by archaeologists whose work confirms the accuracy of Caesar's topographical descriptions while revealing the sophistication of Celtic defensive preparations. Ground-penetrating radar and systematic excavation have identified the locations of the defensive works that proved too strong for Roman assault, demonstrating the engineering expertise that Celtic military engineers had developed. The battlefield archaeology at Gergovia has uncovered weapons and military equipment from both sides of the conflict, providing physical evidence of the fighting that Caesar describes in his account of his only major defeat in Gaul. The discovery of Roman siege equipment abandoned during the retreat confirms his description of the failed assault, while Celtic weapons found in Roman positions support his account of effective counterattacks that drove his forces from their advanced positions. The strategic withdrawal that Vercingetorix conducted after Gergovia demonstrates the sophisticated military thinking that Caesar grudgingly acknowledges in his account. Archaeological evidence of scorched earth tactics throughout the Loire Valley confirms Caesar's description of the systematic destruction of crops and settlements that denied Roman forces the supplies necessary for sustained operations, forcing Caesar to modify his campaign strategy and ultimately leading to the concentration of forces at Alesia. The decision to make a stand at Alesia reflected Vercingetorix's assessment that the revolt required a decisive confrontation that would either secure Celtic independence or result in the final destruction of organized resistance. Archaeological surveys of the site have confirmed Caesar's descriptions of the defensive advantages that made Alesia attractive as a fortress, while excavations within the oppidum have revealed evidence of the preparations that Celtic forces made for the siege that would determine the fate of Gallic independence.
In the wake of conquest, as the smoke cleared from burning Uppida and the last echoes of Celtic war horns faded into memory, a slower but no less profound transformation began to reshape the very soul of Gallic civilization. The process that historians would later term Romanization was not the simple imposition of foreign customs upon a defeated population, but rather a complex cultural metamorphosis that would create something entirely new, a synthesis of Celtic tradition and Roman innovation that would endure for centuries and influence the development of European civilization long after the fall of the empire itself. The administrative changes that followed the collapse of organized Celtic resistance reflected both Roman administrative expertise and practical recognition that governing such vast territories and diverse populations required flexible approaches that accommodated local conditions while imposing imperial authority. The traditional Celtic political structures, based on tribal assemblies and elected magistrates, were replaced by Roman administrative units that fragmented large tribal territories into smaller, more manageable civitates. But these new divisions deliberately preserved certain tribal identities while separating traditional allies and grouping former enemies under common Roman authority. The establishment of the three Gauls represented the culmination of Augustus's administrative reforms and demonstrated Roman understanding of the geographic and cultural diversity that characterized the conquered territories. Gallia Aquitania encompassed the southwestern regions between the Pyrenees and the Loire River, including territories that had maintained distinct cultural identities influenced by contact with Iberian peoples and characterized by different linguistic traditions and social customs that required specialized administrative approaches. Gallia Lugdunensis, the largest of the three provinces, extended from the Loire Valley to the English Channel and included the territories of the most powerful pre-conquest tribal confederations, encompassing nearly 200,000 square kilometers of the economic heartland of Gaul. The province contained the fertile agricultural regions that had supported large populations and the mineral resources that had funded Celtic military resistance, making it the most valuable and strategically important component of the new imperial acquisition. The capital at Lugdunum, strategically positioned at the confluence of the Rhone and Saône rivers, became the administrative center for the entire Gallic prefecture, while housing the altar of Rome and Augustus that served as the focal point for imperial cult activities designed to create loyalty to the emperor and imperial institutions. The city's location enabled it to control trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world with northern Europe, while providing a secure base for military operations and administrative activities throughout the region. Gallia Belgica covered the northern territories from the Seine to the Rhine, including regions that had maintained the closest contacts with Germanic peoples across the frontier, and that would continue to serve as a buffer against Germanic expansion throughout the imperial period. The province's strategic importance derived from its position as a barrier against barbarian incursions and its control of trade routes connecting Britain with the continental interior, making it essential for both military security and commercial prosperity. The gradual adoption of Roman law represented one of the most significant aspects of the Romanization process, fundamentally altering the legal relationships that governed Celtic society, while providing opportunities for ambitious individuals to advance their careers through mastery of Roman legal procedures.
The traditional Celtic legal system, maintained by druids who memorized vast collections of precedents and procedures, was based on customary law that varied between tribes and emphasized collective responsibility for individual actions, creating a complex web of obligations and relationships that reflected Celtic social values.
Roman law, codified in written statutes and administered by professional magistrates, introduced concepts of individual legal responsibility and standardized procedures that applied uniformly across all territories under Roman control, creating predictable legal frameworks that facilitated commercial activities and property ownership, while providing mechanisms for dispute resolution that did not depend on personal relationships or tribal affiliations. The transition from Celtic to Roman legal practices created opportunities for ambitious Celtic nobles who could master the complexities of Roman jurisprudence while maintaining their influence within their communities. The establishment of Roman courts in major settlements throughout Gaul provided Celtic populations with access to legal procedures that offered advantages over traditional methods of dispute resolution, particularly in commercial matters that involved parties from different tribal backgrounds or that required enforcement across tribal boundaries. Roman law's emphasis on written contracts and documentary evidence appealed to merchants and landowners who required predictable legal frameworks for commercial activities, while the system's protection of property rights encouraged agricultural investment and commercial development that increased overall regional prosperity. The integration of Celtic legal traditions with Roman jurisprudence created hybrid systems that preserved elements of customary law while adopting Roman procedural standards, enabling the legal system to function effectively while minimizing cultural disruption that might have generated resistance to Roman authority. Local magistrates, often drawn from established Celtic noble families, administered justice according to Roman legal principles while maintaining sensitivity to traditional Celtic customs and social relationships that continued to influence community life. The transformation of Celtic languages under Roman influence represented a gradual process that varied significantly across different regions and social classes, with Latin becoming the language of administration, commerce, and formal education, while creating practical incentives for Celtic elites to achieve fluency in the imperial language. The Roman educational system, established in major urban centers throughout Gaul, provided instruction in Latin literature, rhetoric, and law that enabled Celtic nobles to participate fully in imperial political and cultural life, while maintaining their local influence and authority. The persistence of Celtic languages in rural areas and among lower social classes created linguistic diversity that characterized Gallic society throughout the Roman period, with agricultural communities isolated from major commercial centers and administrative capitals, maintaining their traditional languages while gradually adopting Latin vocabulary related to new technologies, legal concepts, and religious practices. This linguistic evolution created regional dialects that combined Celtic grammatical structures with Latin lexical elements, producing languages that were distinctly Gallo-Roman in character.
The adoption of Roman customs by Celtic elites reflected both practical considerations and genuine cultural attraction to Mediterranean civilization, with the Roman lifestyle's emphasis on urban amenities, literary culture, and sophisticated material comforts appealing to Celtic nobles who had accumulated wealth through collaboration with Roman administrators or success in commercial activities. The construction of Roman-style villas in rural areas demonstrated the extent to which Celtic landowners had adopted Roman architectural preferences and domestic arrangements while maintaining agricultural operations that continued to employ traditional Celtic farming methods. The Roman bathing culture, with its emphasis on public socialization and physical wellness, found particular acceptance among Celtic populations who had maintained strong communal traditions throughout their pre-conquest history. The construction of public baths in major settlements provided venues for social interaction that transcended traditional tribal boundaries while introducing Roman concepts of civic life and public responsibility that gradually transformed Celtic understanding of community relationships and individual obligations to broader social groups. The transformation of Celtic settlements into Roman-style cities represented one of the most visible aspects of the Romanization process, with traditional Celtic oppida, built on elevated terrain for defensive purposes, gradually abandoned in favor of new urban centers constructed according to Roman planning principles that emphasized accessibility, commercial efficiency, and administrative convenience. These new cities, laid out in regular grids with central forums, public buildings, and residential districts, provided the infrastructure necessary for Roman administrative and commercial activities while offering improved living conditions for urban populations. The forum complexes that anchored these new urban centers served multiple functions that extended beyond their immediate practical purposes, with basilicas providing venues for legal proceedings, commercial transactions, and public assemblies that brought together diverse populations under Roman institutional frameworks. The temples that flanked forum spaces introduced Roman religious practices while providing opportunities for the syncretism of Celtic and Roman deities that facilitated cultural integration without completely abandoning traditional spiritual beliefs. The development of Roman-style residential architecture reflected changing social aspirations of Celtic elites who had prospered under Roman rule, with traditional Celtic roundhouses, constructed of wood and thatch, gradually replaced by rectangular stone buildings featuring hypocaust heating systems, glass windows, and elaborate decorative programs that demonstrated their owners' wealth and cultural sophistication. These architectural changes represented more than aesthetic preferences. They reflected fundamental alterations in domestic life and social relationships that accompanied the adoption of Roman cultural practices. The integration of Celtic nobility into Roman political structures created opportunities for advancement that exceeded anything available under traditional Celtic arrangements, with the Roman cursus honorum providing ambitious Celtic nobles with clearly defined pathways to political influence and social prestige that transcended tribal boundaries. Service in local magistracies, followed by advancement to provincial positions and potentially imperial offices, offered careers that could elevate individuals from provincial obscurity to positions of influence within the broader Roman world. The military service that provided many Celtic nobles with their introduction to Roman culture and political systems proved to be one of the most effective mechanisms for cultural integration, with auxiliary units that recruited Celtic warriors providing training in Roman military techniques while exposing recruits to Roman values, customs, and social relationships. The veterans who returned to their communities after completing military service brought with them knowledge of Roman practices and connections to Roman administrative networks that facilitated their integration into colonial society. The emergence of Celtic equestrian families represented the success of Roman policies designed to create local elites with vested interests in imperial stability, with these families often descended from traditional Celtic nobles who had collaborated with Roman administrators, accumulating wealth through landholding, commercial activities, and imperial service. Their sons received Roman educations and pursued careers that took them throughout the empire, creating networks of influence that connected Gallic communities to the broader Roman world while maintaining essential links to their Celtic heritage. The religious transformation that accompanied political and cultural Romanization involved complex processes of syncretism that preserved Celtic spiritual traditions while incorporating Roman theological concepts and ritual practices, creating hybrid religious systems that satisfied both Celtic religious sensibilities and Roman administrative requirements. The Roman policy of Interpretatio Romana, which identified Celtic deities with Roman counterparts, facilitated religious integration while maintaining continuity with traditional Celtic spiritual life, and enabling the preservation of sacred sites and religious practices that had deep cultural significance. By the end of the 1st century CE, the Romanization of Gaul had created a unique civilization that combined the best elements of both Celtic and Roman traditions, while establishing foundations for the medieval European civilization that would emerge from the collapse of imperial authority. The success of this cultural synthesis would be tested by the crises of the 3rd century, when Germanic invasions and imperial instability would threaten to destroy the prosperous and stable society that 3 centuries of Roman rule had created in the former lands of the Gauls.
As the 3rd century dawned dark and bloody, the Pax Romana that had sheltered Gaul for 2 centuries began to crack like ice in spring, and through those cracks poured the Germanic tribes who would reshape the map of Europe, while the empire that had once seemed eternal struggled to maintain its authority over territories that had grown accustomed to peace and prosperity. The crisis that engulfed the Roman world during this period struck the Gallic provinces with particular severity due to their strategic position along the Rhine frontier and their economic importance to the imperial system that had become increasingly dependent on Gallic agricultural production and manufacturing capabilities. The military pressures that initiated this period of instability emerged from beyond the Rhine, where Germanic tribal confederations had been consolidating their strength and expanding their territorial ambitions throughout the early 3rd century, while developing new forms of political organization that enabled them to coordinate military operations across vast territories. The Alemanni, a coalition of Germanic tribes whose name meant all men, had established their dominance over territories in what is now southwestern Germany and eastern Switzerland, creating a military confederation that represented a significant evolution from earlier Germanic tribal structures. The Alemannic military organization combined traditional Germanic warrior culture with innovations learned through centuries of contact with Roman forces, creating armies that could conduct sustained campaigns against Roman frontier defenses while maintaining the mobility and tactical flexibility that characterized Germanic warfare. Their infantry formations featured heavily armed warriors carrying long spears, broad-bladed swords, and wooden shields reinforced with iron bosses, while their cavalry units provided reconnaissance and pursuit capabilities that enhanced the Confederation's strategic mobility and tactical effectiveness. The first major Alemannic incursion into Gallic territory occurred in 213 CE, when approximately 20,000 warriors crossed the Rhine near Mogontiacum and advanced into the interior of Gallia Superior,
demonstrating the inadequacy of Roman garrison forces that had been weakened by troop withdrawals for campaigns in other theaters. The Roman defensive system, designed for containing limited raids rather than repelling major invasions, proved incapable of preventing Germanic penetration into the Gallic heartland, where prosperous communities had grown unaccustomed to warfare and lacked the fortifications necessary for sustained defense. The Alemannic raiders, employing hit-and-run tactics that maximized their mobility while avoiding direct confrontation with Roman fortifications, devastated the countryside throughout the Vosges region before withdrawing across the Rhine with substantial plunder and captives, demonstrating both the vulnerability of Gallic settlements and the limitations of Roman military responses. The economic impact of these raids extended far beyond the immediate destruction they caused, with agricultural communities abandoning exposed settlements for the protection of fortified towns, while commercial networks suffered severe disruption as merchants avoided routes that passed through areas subject to Germanic incursions. The Roman military response to these threats revealed the extent to which imperial resources had been stretched by simultaneous crises on multiple frontiers. With the Rhine army, traditionally the strongest force in the Western Empire, reduced to approximately 40,000 men distributed among dozens of fortifications along a frontier that extended for over 500 kilometers. Many of these garrisons consisted of local militia units with limited training and equipment, while the veteran legions that had previously anchored frontier defense had been transferred to campaigns in Mesopotamia and along the Danube, leaving Gaul vulnerable to Germanic attacks that exceeded the capacity of remaining forces to repel. The inadequacy of conventional Roman defensive strategies became apparent during the massive Alemannic invasion of 233 CE, when Germanic forces numbering an estimated 70,000 warriors penetrated deep into Gallic territory and besieged several major cities, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of Roman fortification techniques and siege warfare that enabled them to conduct prolonged operations against urban centers. The siege of Vercingetorix lasted for 3 months, during which the Germanic forces demonstrated their ability to coordinate complex military operations while maintaining supply lines and preventing Roman relief efforts. The civilian population of Gallic cities experienced the full horror of 3rd century warfare during these sieges, with inhabitants trapped within their walls while Germanic forces controlled the surrounding countryside and prevented the delivery of food and supplies necessary for survival. The archaeological evidence from this period reveals hasty burials, hidden treasure hoards, and the systematic destruction of public buildings that characterized the urban crisis of the 3rd century, creating traumatic experiences that fundamentally altered the relationship between Gallic communities and Roman imperial authority. The emergence of the Gallic Empire in 260 CE represented both a response to Roman military failure and an assertion of regional autonomy that reflected the growing political sophistication of Gallic leadership and their recognition that imperial institutions had proven inadequate for protecting provincial populations. Marcus Cassianus Latinius Postumus, the Roman general who proclaimed himself emperor in Gaul, possessed the military experience and political connections necessary to establish an alternative imperial structure that could address the specific needs of the Gallic provinces, while maintaining Roman constitutional forms and administrative procedures. The political structure that Postumus established in the Gallic Empire demonstrated the administrative capabilities that Gallic leaders had developed through centuries of participation in Roman governance, with the imperial court at Augusta Trevorum functioning according to Roman constitutional principles while addressing regional needs that the central government had been unable to meet. The Senate that advised the Gallic emperor included representatives from major Gallic cities and tribal territories, creating a governing body that combined Roman institutional forms with Celtic traditions of collective decision-making. The military organization of the Gallic Empire reflected Postumus's understanding of the strategic challenges facing the region and his ability to mobilize local resources for defense against Germanic incursions and Roman reconquest attempts. The army that served the Gallic emperors included both regular Roman units that had declared their loyalty to the breakaway regime and newly recruited formations drawn from Gallic communities, creating forces that numbered approximately 60,000 men at the height of the empire's power and were equipped with standardized weapons and armor produced in workshops throughout the region. The economic policies implemented by the Gallic Empire addressed the disruption caused by Germanic raids, while maintaining the commercial relationships that had sustained Gallic prosperity throughout the imperial period. The imperial administration established state-controlled workshops that produced military equipment, pottery, and textiles for both domestic consumption and export to other regions, while the coinage issued by Gallic emperors maintained the silver content and artistic quality that characterized imperial currency and ensured continued acceptance in international trade. The defensive strategies employed by the Gallic Empire represented significant innovations in frontier warfare that would influence Roman military practice for centuries, with mobile defense systems that could respond rapidly to Germanic incursions, replacing static fortification lines that had proven inadequate against determined attacks. These forces, based in fortified camps located at strategic points throughout the interior, could concentrate quickly to confront major threats while maintaining the flexibility necessary to pursue raiding parties and protect vulnerable communities. The success of these defensive innovations became apparent during the Alemannic invasion of 268 CE, when Gallic forces under the command of Victorinus defeated a Germanic army of approximately 40,000 warriors near Durocortorum, demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated infantry and cavalry operations that maximized the advantages of Roman training and equipment while adapting to the tactical challenges posed by Germanic warfare. The Gallic victory, achieved through superior discipline and tactical coordination, restored confidence in Roman military capabilities while demonstrating the effectiveness of regional leadership that understood local conditions and could respond rapidly to emerging threats. The collapse of the Gallic Empire under Tetricus resulted from a combination of military pressure from the restored Roman Empire under Aurelian and internal political divisions that weakened the breakaway regime's ability to maintain unity among Gallic populations. The forces that Aurelian assembled for the reconquest of Gaul included veteran legions from the eastern campaigns and Germanic auxiliary units that provided the numerical superiority necessary to overcome Gallic resistance, while the Battle of Chalon in 274 CE marked the end of Gallic independence and the restoration of Roman imperial authority throughout the region.
As the Roman eagle's shadow retreated southward and the last Latin inscriptions weathered on abandoned monuments, new kingdoms arose from the ashes of the old, carrying within them faint echoes of the Celtic voices that had once filled these lands with songs of warriors and druids, sacred groves and golden torques.
The 5th and 6th centuries witnessed the final transformation of Gaul from a Romano-Celtic province into a collection of Germanic kingdoms, a process that would complete the cultural metamorphosis that had begun with Caesar's conquest and continued through 4 centuries of imperial rule. The Frankish Confederation that emerged along the Lower Rhine during the late 3rd century represented a new form of Germanic political organization that combined traditional tribal structures with innovations learned through contact with Roman civilization, creating military and administrative capabilities that would eventually dominate all of Gaul. The Salian Franks, who occupied territories in what is now the Netherlands and Belgium, had developed agricultural and commercial practices that enabled them to support larger populations than previous Germanic societies, while maintaining the warrior traditions that made them formidable opponents for any remaining Roman forces. The gradual Frankish expansion into northern Gaul during the 4th and 5th centuries occurred through a combination of military conquest, peaceful settlement, and intermarriage with the existing Gallo-Roman population, creating a complex cultural synthesis that preserved elements of both Germanic and Roman traditions while establishing new forms of social organization and political authority. The Frankish kings, who emerged during this period, wielded power through personal relationships and military success rather than the institutional authority that had characterized Roman governance, creating governmental systems that reflected Germanic values while adapting to the administrative requirements of governing settled agricultural populations. The reign of Clovis, who unified the Frankish tribes under his authority and extended their control throughout most of Gaul between 481 and 511 CE, marked the definitive end of Roman political authority in the region, while establishing the foundations for the medieval European civilization that would develop over the following centuries. The Battle of Soissons in 486 CE, where Clovis defeated Syagrius, the last Roman commander in Gaul, involved approximately 15,000 Frankish warriors organized into disciplined formations that combined traditional Germanic fighting methods with tactical innovations learned through contact with Roman military forces. The Frankish conquest of the remaining Roman territories proceeded through systematic campaigns that eliminated all vestiges of imperial authority while incorporating Roman administrative personnel and practices into the new Germanic governmental structures. Clovis ordered the execution of rival Frankish leaders while sparing Roman officials who possessed the technical expertise necessary for governing complex territorial entities, creating hybrid administrative systems that combine Germanic political traditions with Roman bureaucratic efficiency. The conversion of Clovis to Catholic Christianity around 496 CE represented a calculated political decision that enabled him to gain the support of the Gallo-Roman population, while distinguishing his kingdom from the Arian Christian Visigothic and Vandal realms that controlled other former Roman territories. The baptism ceremony at Reims, conducted by Bishop Remigius, before an audience that included both Frankish warriors and Gallo-Roman nobles, symbolically united the Germanic and Roman populations under a common religious identity, while establishing the Catholic Church as the primary institution capable of bridging cultural divisions.
The ecclesiastical organization that emerged under Frankish rule created new forms of cultural authority that gradually replaced both Roman administrative structures and the last remnants of Celtic religious traditions that had survived the imperial period. The bishops who governed Christian communities throughout Gaul, many of whom were drawn from prominent Gallo-Roman families, possessed the education and administrative experience necessary to maintain some continuity with Roman institutional practices while adapting to the realities of Germanic political control.
The systematic suppression of pagan practices that characterized the Christianization of Gaul involved the destruction of temples, sacred groves, and ritual sites that had maintained connections to pre-Christian religious traditions throughout the Roman period. The Celtic sanctuaries that had survived through syncretic adaptations with Roman deities were systematically demolished or converted to Christian purposes, eliminating the physical spaces where traditional Celtic religious practices had been maintained and severing the last institutional links to the pre-conquest Celtic world. The monastic movement that spread throughout Gaul during the 6th and 7th centuries created new centers of learning and cultural preservation that gradually replaced the secular educational institutions that had sustained Gallo-Roman intellectual life while developing new forms of artistic expression that combined Christian themes with elements derived from both Roman and Germanic traditions. The monasteries established by figures like Saint Columbanus and Saint Eligius became repositories for classical texts and Christian writings while creating new works that reflected the cultural synthesis emerging from the fusion of Germanic, Roman, and residual Celtic elements. The linguistic changes that occurred during this period involved the gradual disappearance of Celtic languages that had survived the Roman period in rural areas and among lower social classes, as Frankish administrators and Christian missionaries promoted the use of Latin and increasingly Germanic languages in official and religious contexts. The Gaulish language, which had maintained its vitality in certain regions despite centuries of Romanization, gradually disappeared as speakers adopted Latin or Frankish to participate in the new political and religious structures, marking the final extinction of the spoken Celtic tongues that had once resounded through the forests and valleys of ancient Gaul. The archaeological evidence for the survival of Celtic elements in post-Roman Gaul reveals the complex processes of cultural transformation that characterized this period, with metalwork traditions that had produced distinctive Celtic artistic objects continuing to influence the decorative arts of the Frankish period as Germanic craftsmen incorporated Celtic motifs into their own artistic vocabulary. The agricultural practices that had sustained Celtic communities for centuries underwent significant changes as Germanic settlers introduced different farming methods and land use patterns that reflected their own environmental adaptations and cultural preferences. By 800 CE, when Charlemagne was crowned emperor and the Carolingian Renaissance began to create new forms of European civilization, the ancient Celtic world of the Gauls had effectively ceased to exist as a living culture. The languages, religious practices, political institutions, and artistic traditions that had defined Celtic identity for over a millennium had been absorbed into the broader synthesis of Germanic, Roman, and Christian elements that would characterize medieval European civilization. The legacy of the Gauls would survive only in archaeological remains, place names, and the folk memories preserved in later medieval literature, while the territories they had once ruled became the foundation for the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire. The transformation was complete. Where once Celtic warriors had ridden to battle with painted faces and golden torques, where druids had conducted sacred ceremonies in oak groves, where craftsmen had created masterpieces of flowing bronze and iron, there now stood Christian churches, Germanic manor houses, and the administrative centers of a new civilization that had incorporated the best elements of all its predecessors while creating something entirely unprecedented in human